by the end of 1972, Neil Young was a bona fide star of the music world. Harvest was the biggest selling album of 1972 in the USA. Heart of Gold had reached number 1 in the singles chart, and he was part of the biggest supergroup of the era, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. With a big album, a big tour was to follow, and rehearsals for this big tour began in the fall of 1972 at Neil Young's Broken Arrow Ranch in California. The backing band with Neil was to be the Stray Gators, who had recorded Harvest with Neil Young, plus Danny Whitten from Crazy Horse. When Whitten arrived at Neil Young's ranch, though, to start rehearsals, it quickly became apparent that Whitten was not in a good shape. He had actually spent most of the last year becoming a full-on heroin addict. He'd been going on heroin and coke, speedball binges, stealing his friends' guitars for drug money, and holed himself up in his apartment for months on end. When he wasn't mainlining, he was trying to get off it by binging on tequila and Valium. Jack Nietzsche was the first to notice the state that Whitten was in, telling Whitten to his face that he could tell that he was using. Whitten protested that it was just booze and Valium, but Nietzsche had grave doubts and tried to warn Young of the condition that Whitten was in. Rehearsals went badly, with drummer Kenny Buttrey noticing that the guitarist would fall asleep standing up during a song and then start playing perfectly in time only after the song had already finished. Whitten requested a separate trailer to stay in while he was staying on Neil Young's ranch, away from the rest of the musicians, which was also a bad sign. He spent more and more time in his trailer alone, not eating the sandwiches that Neil Young's wife, Carrie Snodgrass, brought to him. Young, to his credit, refused to give up on him and would go over to the trailer and sat down with him and went through songs with him, trying to get him to learn them. Young was convinced Whitten would still be fine, that any day now he would turn things around somehow and get better. But Danny Whitten did not get any better, and Young was faced with a huge dilemma. He had the biggest tour of his career coming up, off the back of a huge hit album, playing to sold out arenas. It was clear though Danny couldn't cut it. Young had to make a decision, so one day Whitten was given $50 and a plane ticket back to LA. He got the flight back, becoming so drunk on the plane that he had to be restrained. Later that same day, November the 18th, 1972, he ended up at a friend's house in LA, and at one point he went to the bathroom and he never came out. His autopsy stated that he had died of acute diazepam and ethanol intoxication, Valium and booze. That night, the phone rang at the ranch sometime between 12 and 1 a.m. It was the LAPD informing Young that they had found a white male with no identification apart from a handwritten note that had Neil Young's phone number on it. News of Whitten's death circulated amongst the musicians at the ranch, but it was not actually discussed openly. "We never talked about it," Kenny Buttrey said. This bottling up of grief would not only have a profound impact on the imminent tour, but also on the next few records that Neil Young would make. The death of Danny Whitten cast a very long shadow over Young and everyone involved at the ranch. Young later told Cameron Crowe that he had loved Danny and he felt responsible for his death, and he went on to feel like that for a very long time. He also said, "Every musician has one guy on the planet that they can play with better than anyone else. You only get one guy. My guy was Danny Whitten." The day after Danny's death, Young wrote the song "Don't Be Denied." It was an autobiographical song that recounted being beaten up at school, his parents' divorce, using music to pursue a dream, and what happens when that dream fails. The song repeats over and over, "Don't be denied, don't be denied," almost as if he's trying to convince himself. Young said that "Don't Be Denied" had a lot to do with Danny Whitten. He said, "I think that's the first really major life and death event that really affected me." He said, "You realise life is so impermanent, so you want to do the very best you can whilst you're here and say whatever the fuck it is you're going to say. Express yourself." But Whitten's death, devastating as it was only the beginning of the nightmare for this tour, and they were still only at the rehearsal stage. The question of money further soured the atmosphere amongst the musicians. Drummer Kenny Buttrey had asked Young for more money to compensate for the loss of the lucrative session work that he would have to turn down. He asked for $100,000, and Elliot Roberts and Neil Young agreed to this, but the other musicians got wind of this as well and soon wanted the same. When the issue came up in rehearsal, Young said, "We can talk about this later," but Jack Nietzsche, self-admittedly drunk as a skunk, forced Neil to settle the issue there and then, which pissed Young off royally in the process. Neil yelled, "Okay, you got $100,000. Are you happy now? Will that make you play better?" Nietzsche said, "I don't think things ever recovered after that." The upcoming tour was a monster. 65 dates across the USA over 3 months, all in big, sold-out arenas. The first date was Milwaukee Auditorium on January the 5th. 1973. The opening act was a reportedly terrified Linda Ronstadt, joining them for the 3-month tour. Ronstadt was often on the end of Jack Nietzsche's drunken taunts, who was acting out, suffering from his own form of stage fright, which he tried to overcome with copious amounts of booze. He later said, "I was an asshole." The band travelled in an old Lockheed Electra propeller plane from the 50s, smoking vast quantities of incredibly strong dope through a giant homemade hookah reportedly built from an aquarium pump. "It was like putting your mouth over the exhaust pipe of a car," said bassist Tim Drummond. Young's wife, Carrie Snodgrass, was also around for a lot of the tour, rolling joints with a crazy bunch of characters around her, according to producer Elliot Mazer. But he said there was a certain vibe to her and Neil's relationship at this point. Something wasn't right, and I think Neil knew it, he said. Carrie felt a kind of wall developing between her and Neil. He was getting really tied up with the pressure, she said later, and noted Young was now uncharacteristically drinking heavily. Ken Viola, musician, filmmaker, and Neil Young superfan from the Buffalo Springfield days, had a disturbing encounter with Young backstage at the Boston Music Hall. Neil came bursting out, grabbed me by the lapels, stuck his face right in my face, and shouted, "They're gonna win the war!" He said Young was out of his mind on booze and out of control more than he had ever seen him before or since. He let go of me, he pushed through the outside doors, ran outside for a while until Elliot Roberts dragged him back in again. Musically, although the set list from this tour did include most of the songs from Harvest, played by the same musicians who played on the album, from the first date to the last date, Young and the Stray Gators played a lot of new songs, which were very different to the radio-friendly country rock of Harvest. Songs like Don't Be Denied, Look Out Joe, LA, Last Dance, Borrowed Tune, all raw and fairly bleak in their outlook, full of depictions of lowlives, junkies, and lost souls trapped in a kind of urban purgatory. Young had tried to record these songs before the tour started during the rehearsal stage, but was unsatisfied with the results, so instead he decided to record the new songs out on the road. Young and producer Elliot Mazer hastily assembled a mobile recording truck, so all the new songs were eventually captured over the course of the tour. As the tour got underway, the tensions never really relented. Even the sound checks were rough. Kenny Buttrey said that once someone had brought a review in about last night's show to the sound check, and it was a bad review. Young knocked the paper out of the person's hand with his guitar and knocked all the microphones over as well, and said, "Don't ever do that shit again." Young separated himself from his bandmates as well, and often stayed on a completely separate floor from the rest of the crew when they stayed in hotels, and became more and more unapproachable. There was always a lecture in the dressing room after the show, said Nietzsche. One night he'd be telling them to loosen up a bit and not be so stiff and play what you feel, not what we rehearsed. And then the next night he'd say, "I can't let you guys just ramble on and play whatever the fuck you want. Stick to the arrangement." After this went on, night after night, Nietzsche says eventually he snapped and he said, "Why don't you put both of these speeches on a tape and tell us which one to play in our hotel room. Nietzsche drank more and more to cope with his stage fright, becoming ever more hostile to Young in the process. Elliot Mazer said Nietzsche would talk shit into the microphone during the performances, which the audience wouldn't hear, but they could back in the recording truck. So after Young sang a line, Nietzsche would say into the microphone, "I don't believe that bullshit," leaving the guys in the sound truck in hysterics. In fact, Nietzsche got so sick of Young that one night he went up to Young's room and pissed all over the carpet. Neil was so gone himself at this point, he was pretty much unfazed. Drummer Kenny Buttrey got a lot of stick, no pun intended, on this tour from Young, innocently trying out a few drum fills during one sound check. Young jumped down his throat immediately. "That's what I don't want. Don't ever do that again." He says, "From that day on, I never played a single drum fill ever again. No extra stuff." Things got even worse as the tour progressed. Young started complaining that Buttrey's drumming just wasn't loud enough. Being a studio drummer, he was already playing the loudest drums he'd ever played in his life, and didn't really know how to get any louder. Young kept sending Buttrey to buy bigger and bigger drumsticks, until one day the store clerk said, "Son, any bigger than this, it's going to have bark on it." Young was reportedly so enraged by Buttrey's seeming inability to play the way he desired that at one point he took one of his drumsticks and plunged it through the skin of Buttrey's snare drum and stormed out. He said, "I was playing 10 times louder than I'd ever played in my life." He said, I was trying thicker heads, bigger sticks. He said, "I looked down at the snare one night and I saw blood splatter. My hand was bleeding, dripping down the drumstick. When I hit the drum, blood would be flying through the air." Halfway through the tour, Buttrey was replaced by Johnny Barbata, who had replaced Dallas Taylor in CSNY. Things improved a little, but not much, Young said. Part of Young's discombobulation was down to the guitar he was using on this tour, a Gibson Flying V. His Les Paul Old Black was out of action at this time with a broken pickup, and the Flying V was causing constant problems. It wouldn't stay in tune. The sound was never quite right. Young reportedly spent hours before each show moving around the amps, adjusting the mics, looking for a sound that he could never quite get, driving his bandmates and the crew crazy. Jimmy McDonough, in his book Shaky, says that by the time the band played at the Cleveland Arena on the 11th of February, they had gained a 6th member of the band. His name was Jose Cuervo. During the encore of this show, a tequila-saturated Young started losing his mind with the apparently apathetic audience, who were there to hear all of his familiar Harvest hits. He mumbled incoherently into the mic during the intro to Last Dance, yet another song that the audience had never heard before. The band lumbered into a brutal version of the song, complete with one of Young's most ragged vocal performances. Screaming ad-libs at the nonplussed crowd. Tedium, boredom, no. Towards the end of the tour, Young's voice had gone completely, blown out from all those drunken screaming ad-libs. Some dates had to be cancelled. David Crosby and Graham Nash were drafted in to provide vocal support for the remaining dates. And whilst they might have sweetened up the vocals a bit, they did nothing for the tensions, which were still running rampant. Nietzsche in particular fell out with Crosby almost instantly. Nietzsche felt Crosby was way too loud on stage and told him this to his face, to which Crosby replied, "Don't tell me, man, I've been doing this my whole life." Nietzsche spat back, "And you'll be doing it for the rest of your life, you fat fuck." Towards the end of the tour, on the 31st of March at Oakland Coliseum, the encore was Southern Man, and in their excitement the crowd rushed the stage, with a black cop punching an overzealous fan in the process. Young stopped playing, saying, I can't fucking sing this with this happening." Young walked off stage to the surprise of his bandmates, but they quickly followed. "We got to get out here, this place is going to go up." They left abruptly, the crew being pelted with bottles as they jumped into the limo and sped away into the night. In October 1973, the album Time Fades Away was released. With the exception of Love in Mind, which was recorded in 1971, every song was recorded live on this tour. Looking back in 1987, in an interview, Young said it was his least favourite record and also the worst record I ever made, but as a documentary of what was happening to me, it was a great record, and that's the part that I agree with. Much is still made of this quote saying that Neil hates this album, thinks it's bad. The quote itself is nearly 40 years old, and most people don't quote the second part of that quote. Time Fades Away is a great album. Like the two albums that followed it, there are no weak songs, and certainly no half-hearted performances. Ragged, yes, but with an emotional directness. This was Young's idea of creating an audio documentary, which he had first tried to do with Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, finally realised fully. He may not have enjoyed listening back to the results, but to his credit, he didn't shy away from offering it up to the audience. One thing you definitely can't accuse Young of here is playing it safe. He could have chosen the track listing to be a mix of familiar songs, songs from Harvest, some old favourites, and made a perfectly good live album, which would have sold decent numbers and got positive reviews. Instead, he chose all new, unreleased songs being performed on stage for the first time to an audience who were mostly there just to hear Heart of Gold and Old Man. Then there was the songs themselves, not a continuation of the slick country rock and ornately arranged orchestral pieces from Harvest, but instead a snapshot of a band teetering on the edge of chaos, drunk on bottled up grief, swimming in interpersonal turmoil, which gave songs which, under other circumstances, might have seemed vaguely optimistic, songs like LA, Last Dance, a troubling, ominous atmosphere. The first song on the album, Time Fades Away, sets the mood straight away with the opening line, 14 junkies, too weak to work. An early manuscript for the song, which was at first called Back by 8, had slightly different lyrics here. There were no references to junkies initially, and it also had chords written out, which were for Neil and Danny Whitten to go over together so he could teach him the song. Soon after Whitten's death, the lines about junkies were added. By the time of the last verse, of course, the 14 junkies have become 13 junkies.
Son, don't be home too late. Try to get back by 8. Son, don't wait till the break of day.
The song Journey Through the Past was not completely unheard at this point. He had already played it on the BBC In Concert special in 1971. One of 3 solo piano songs, each comes as a welcoming sonic counterpoint to the electric onslaught of the other songs.
Come back to mine on a journey through the past. Will I still be in your eyes and on your mind?
Yonder Stands the Sinner. Here we can hear Young's voice at full strain, cracking under the pressure, creating some great moments, including towards the end of the second verse, where he screams the word sinner. Sinner! Sinner! Fantastic stuff. One of the most manic vocal performances I've ever heard from Neil Young on any recording. The album is worth it just for those moments alone, but there's a lot more going on musically as well. The band is boozed up and sloppy, and in a way that doesn't seem inappropriate for this context. LA is a great song. Interesting contrast between the bluesy main riff and the smooth, woozy major 7th chords of the chorus. Just like the city itself, it has 2 sides, one darker, one lighter. Young wrote this song around the time of when he left Buffalo Springfield, but was paranoid about releasing a song being critical of the city back then, so he just shelved it and apparently forgot about it until Jack Nietzsche reminded him, as he said at a concert on January the 14th in Buffalo. It's not really new, I wrote it in 1968, my friend Jack reminded me about it a couple of weeks ago. He wrote it down and I had to read it all out again because I'd forgotten it totally. Love in Mind was recorded back in 1971, before even Harvest was recorded. Again, it's a welcoming retreat from the raw electric material. Like the album that follows this one, Tonight's the Night, the softer ballads that are included enhance the power of the more tumultuous ensemble recordings. Don't Be Denied, we've touched on already, but Young's voice is cracking here also in places, which does give the autobiographical sketches in the song enormous emotional weight. The bridge is a great song also, giving us one final respite on the road to the last dance. What Young is singing about here, in my opinion, is the immense separation he feels with the loss of a loved one, being forced to part with them forever. It's still possible to build a bridge back to normality, he feels, but it will take a lot of time and effort. Last Dance is a fitting finale for this album. Somehow the ostensibly positive message of you can live your own life, making it happen, working on your own time, in this setting becomes almost a sarcastic refrain, compounded by the final words uttered by Young, which is just the word no repeated over and over. On a number of levels, this album was actually ahead of its time. Recording an album of new songs as a live album had been done before, with the MC5's Kick Out the Jams being a notable example, but it hadn't been done very often, especially for a high-profile artist, which Young now was, coming off the back of a very successful studio record. In 1996, R.E.M. cited Time Fades Away as being a big influence on their recorded live on the road album New Adventures in Hi-Fi. Time Fades Away was recorded directly from the soundboard to 16 track and mixed simultaneously using the Quad 8 CompuMix. No 2-track masters were made of the record, and the master discs were cut directly from the 16-track masters through the CompuMix system. So fascinatingly, this record was actually one of the first to utilise a digital recording process. The record retrospectively came to be known as the first instalment in a trilogy, which was dubbed by fans and critics the Ditch Trilogy, after a comment in Neil Young's liner notes for his 1977 compilation album Decade, where he said, "Heart of Gold put me in the middle of the road. Travelling there soon became a bore, so I headed for the ditch. It was a rougher ride, but I met some more interesting people there." Despite Young's reluctance to revisit this album, it remained out of print for many years, not being reissued again until 2014. The album is a classic, both in a musical sense and as a document of the time. Young's aversion to the album stems from his deep personal turmoil that he experienced both before and during this tour that the album is a document of. It may have been a nightmare for Young, but this tour and this album marked the start of the most fertile, interesting and rawest creative period of his career that has gone a long way into cementing Neil Young as one of the greatest artists of the rock era. In the summer of 1973, Neil Young joined his CSNY bandmates in Hawaii, partly for a vacation, partly to get Stephen Stills off of coke, and to get the band back together and touring again. In Maui, they worked on songs such as Young's Human Highway, which they also chose as a potential title track for a possible new album. Things took a turn though when a visitor turned up, their roadie, Bruce Berry. Berry had been a roadie with CSNY, Manassas, and with the Byrds for their 1973 reunion. He turned up in Maui with a special delivery for the band of a certain white powder that was very popular amongst musicians in the early 70s, and this was basically part of his job description as a roadie at this point. But as one of the main points of the trip was to get away from the nose candy, Nash, Crosby and Young were furious with Berry, and he was sent back to LA, where he immediately went and bought a load more drugs from his friendly local dealer, who also threw in a bunch of the brown stuff along with the white stuff. This stuff was so incredibly potent that, according to his friend and fellow user Richard O'Connell, "I used to have a high tolerance," he said, "but that shit knocked me for a loop." After they enjoyed a heavy night, 3 days later, O'Connell had not heard from his friends since. It was a typically beautiful, sunny California morning when he drove around to his friend's house to see what was up. He knocked on the door of Berry's Santa Monica apartment, but no one answered. Finding the door unlocked, he walked in and was instantly met with the smell of death. He found Berry's lifeless body in the bedroom. The bags of dope were still lying around in the bathroom. Fellow roadie and friend of Berry's, Guillermo Giachetti, said that he never knew that Berry was doing heroin as well as coke after the death of Danny Whitten in the November of 1972. Those in Neil Young's CSNY circle who were using the drug had kept it a very close secret. Those people included David Crosby and CSNY drummer Dallas Taylor. Graham Nash said, "I never knew Cros was on it and he was my best friend." When he was asked what he thought about the death of Berry, Dallas Taylor replied, "I didn't. I just shot dope. That's all I did for 10 years. It was in this morbid atmosphere that CSNY were meant to be recording their triumphant comeback album. So with all this on his mind, on his way to the recording sessions one day, Young suddenly did an about-face. He turned round and drove over to David Briggs's house instead. "There was a knock on my door and it was Neil," Briggs said. "I hadn't seen him in years. He said, I've been doing this record with CSN, but it's all wrong. I want to make a rock and roll record." Young had not worked with Briggs since after the Gold Rush in 1970. After Gold Rush, he had made Harvest with Elliot Mazer, and then made the Journey Through the Past movie, done a huge arena tour, and recorded the Time Fades Away album, put together from recordings on that tour, which was just about to be released at this time. After talking with Briggs, Young went back to Crosby, Stills and Nash and told them that he was too fatigued to start a new project. CSN, who had planned a whole year of their schedule around Young to accommodate a potential new album and tour, were outraged by Young's sudden change of heart, perhaps understandably so. But the reality was, he knew that his actual next project would be far beyond the grasp of CSNY and the Harvest producer Elliot Mazer, and even a lot of his new mainstream audience. Young knew he had to follow the muse, even if she led him into a dark, seedy place, which indeed she did. Young was to take what was left of Crazy Horse along for the ride too. It had been Billy Talbot, the bassist in Crazy Horse, who had instigated a reunion of sorts with Young. He called Young on the phone when Young was in Hawaii with CSNY. Since after the Gold Rush, Crazy Horse had continued without Neil Young and without Danny Whitten. They'd recorded 2 albums without Whitten, Loose and At Crooked Lake, both released in 1972, but according to Billy, when we weren't playing with Neil, we were dog shit. So when Neil was back in town, they played together at a star-studded benefit concert at the Topanga Corral in August, playing a few new songs, including Walk On. Young brought in Ben Keith from the Stray Gators, who had played on Harvest with Young and on the subsequent tour, and he brought back Neil Slofgren, who played on After the Gold Rush. According to Briggs, the band checked into the sleaziest motel they could find on Sunset Boulevard, with the intention of recording the new songs at Sunset Sound, where 4 years previously they'd recorded Oh Lonesome Me and I Believe in You with Danny Whitten. But after just one day at Sunset, Briggs said that he could tell something wasn't right. "Too stiff," he said. "We've got to get out of this studio." Down on Santa Monica Boulevard was a rehearsal space called Studio Instrument Rentals, which was run by Bruce Berry's brother, Ken. "Mind if I knock a hole in your wall?" Briggs asked Ken. Briggs parked a mobile recording truck in the alley next to the building, and then they actually did bash a hole in the wall with a sledgehammer to run the cables from the rehearsal room into the truck. This way the band could play live together on the little stage in the room whilst being recorded. Neither Briggs nor Young let the musicians listen to any of the recordings back whilst they were playing. Briggs mixed the best versions there and then in the truck. It was in this environment that the new songs were recorded, but also even newer ones emerged out of the ether as they played. On the first night of the sessions, they were all sat around a table, and Young casually made the remark, "Okay, tonight's the night." This was repeated, and then it grew into a chant, which grew into an a cappella sing-along, with everyone thumping their hands on the table over and over, "Tonight's the night, tonight's the night." Young then came back the next day with this transformed into a complete song, with lyrics all about Bruce Berry, his life and his demise. And there was another vital ingredient that should not be overlooked. That was their old friend Jose Cuervo. Tequila and hamburgers. That was the input, Young said later. As recording began, Young and the band were actually fairly straight to begin with, a little uptight, impatient over mistakes. However, as the sessions progressed, the tequila flowed, and then so did the music. Tonight's the night. Tonight's the night.
Tonight's the night.
They soon realised that they had to loosen up in order to make this one happen. They recorded exclusively at night, late at night. They would play pool, do coke and drink tequila until way past midnight, and then, and only then, would they start to play the songs. No one said, "Let's go play," drummer Ralph Molina said. We all just knew when it was time. Billy Talbot described the recording sessions as a drunken Irish wake. Neil Young said, "What we were doing was playing those guys on the way. We'd get really high, drink a lot of tequila, get right out on the edge. We were wide open, just wide open." He said, "I was able to step outside of myself to do this record, to become a performer of the songs rather than just the writer. Every song was performed." This recording process was way beyond what Young had attempted before. He had been aiming for spontaneity and live in the moment performances ever since Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, but this went further. With After the Gold Rush, Neil Slofgren said that the recording had been done as live as possible, but still the songs had been very well rehearsed by the time that it came to record them. This time, however, Neil said, "I've made records where you do it 3,000 times and it's perfect. I'm sick of it. I want to make a record that's totally stark naked, raw. I don't want to fix any of it." The original unedited version of the Tonight's the Night album, put together by David Briggs, contained rambling, drunken, often very funny monologues between each song. Sadly, these are now mostly unavailable, although Young has released some of the outtakes of these songs recently on his Archives Volume 2. David Briggs always maintained that his unedited version of the album was the only true version. The band treated the sessions as a live performance, albeit one without an audience apart from Briggs. There were no windows, so it was permanently dark in the room no matter what time it was. Despite this, they rarely took off their sunglasses and remained sufficiently lubricated the entire time. If I wasn't a part of it and I peeked into that room when we were playing, Ralph Molina said, I would have gone, "Whoa, what the fuck's going on here? Who are these weirdos?" Occasionally, visitors did turn up and were gobsmacked by what they saw taking place in the dark at SIR. Photographer Joel Bernstein showed up to take pictures of each band member for their visas for a potential Japanese tour. He said, "It was like doing a documentary on nocturnal animals pulled out from under a rock. They look like little rodents when you shine a light in their eyes." Legendary film director and comedian Mel Brooks also stopped by. He was a friend of Art Linson's, who was Briggs's partner in his Spin Dizzy record label. Brooks observed the musicians sat around basically getting completely shit-faced all night. Then at around midnight they suddenly got up and started recording music. He said, "You mean first they do that and then they do this?" Neil Slofgren needed a little bit more time to adjust to this way of working, perhaps more than the others. "As we learnt the songs, we'd be recording them," he said. "I'd be thinking, okay, another 5 run-throughs and then I'll have my part down." But then Neil would say, "Okay, next song." It freaked us all out. Young was reacting to the way that records were being made in the 1970s. Technology, too much control, not enough creativity in the recording process. It wasn't about music, it wasn't about performing, he said. He also added, "The cleanest, dinkiest, pissantiest sounding records that could possibly be made. I hated that shit." From this era onward, Young had now started recording everything, more or less. Every run through, every gig, every jam session. "I wouldn't play if the tape wasn't running," he said. "Make it so there's no difference between playing and recording. Then you forget that you're recording. I just tricked myself into not having to worry about whether we were recording or not." On August the 26th, Young and the band recorded 5 performances that ended up being on the finished record. Tonight's the Night, Tired Eyes, Mellow My Mind, Speaking Out, and World on a String.
Baby, mellow my mind. Make me feel like a schoolboy good time.
Joni Mitchell stopped by as well, and they jammed and recorded a wonderfully ramshackle version of Mitchell's Raised on Robbery. Mitchell cringed when she heard back the recording, and it didn't see the light of day until the Archives Volume 2 was released by Young in 2020, as Mitchell had asked Young not to release it for many years. It's really good though. They also recorded slightly older songs like Wondering, Everybody's Alone and One More Sign. The sessions went on until September, when they recorded Roll Another Number, Albuquerque, New Mama and Tonight's the Night Part 2. The first attempt at assembling all the songs into an album followed soon after, and the intention was to keep all the drunken dialogue in between the songs. This version only had 9 songs on it, but it had the mumbling and talking between the group and me, Young said later. It was like you didn't know if these guys were still going to be alive in the morning, the way they were talking. More like awake than anything else. David Briggs held on to this original version for years on cassette. I want to tell you, it's a handful, Briggs said. It's unrelenting. There is no relief in it at all. It does not release you for 1 second. It's like some guy having you by the throat from the first note all the way to the end. As this version was nearing completion, Young decided to take the show on the road, and the band played 8 shows at the new Sunset Strip nightclub, the Roxy. In fact, these shows were the first ever shows at the club. The club was a joint venture between David Geffen, Young's manager Elliot Roberts, Lou Adler and Elmer Valentine. On the opening night, the place was filled with all kinds of record label execs, celebrities, as well as regular folk. Young and his band stepped onto the stage and delivered a show no one was ever likely to forget in a hurry. Tonight's the night, the show! Welcome to Miami Beach, ladies and gentlemen. Everything is cheaper than it looks. This was the intriguing and somewhat cryptic way Young would introduce every Tonight's the Night live show. They were keeping the vibe from the SIR recording sessions alive. They'd simply moved the show now out onto a public stage. In fact, they were doubling down on it. They started to accumulate props and wardrobe to fuel the vibe further on the stage. The props included a cigar store Indian, fake palm trees, Hawaiian shirts and a whole bunch of platform glitter boots which Young had duct taped all around the piano. The band came out looking like not only had they not shaved since recording the album, but not even showered either. Young was sporting a pair of Polaroid Coolray 420 fastbacks to cover his bleary bloodshot eyes, and a grey and white seersucker sport coat that Nils Lofgren had gotten from a thrift store. With a thick, unkempt beard, Young, to many in the audience, now resembled Charles Manson's drunk and dishevelled younger brother. Young and the band also brought their wild between-song patter with them from SIR as well, and the tequila. They couldn't forget the tequila. By now they were playing the songs live, night after night, so they actually finished learning them, even though they'd already recorded them. So they dug deeper into the songs and played with even more intensity than on the record. The mood live was completely different, said Lofgren. We were all pissed off about losing a couple of people close to us, and it came out on stage. The vibe was intense but also loose. Young smoked joints that fans threw onto the stage and swigged tequila from a jug that was also passed down to the people in the front. Unlike the Time Fades Away concerts, where the drunkenness had a sort of depressive vibe to it, fueled by the tense atmosphere backstage, Tonight's the Night was the wake. Time to party all the tension out. It was trashed, David Briggs said, but in a controlled way. On the final night at the Roxy, Young got everyone in the audience a drink on the house, which Elliot Roberts was not too impressed with, and offered a pair of glitter boots to the first woman to come up on the stage topless. Young's girlfriend, Carrie Snodgrass, unbuttoned her vest and made her way onto the stage, to the absolute horror of Elliot Roberts and David Geffen. The whole theme of Tonight's the Night was to let go of all that crap and get real, Snodgrass said. So I came up behind Neil, put my arms around his waist. He saw me, started laughing, and then they carried on playing Tonight's the Night. One person who did not really get the point of Tonight's the Night at first was Elliot Roberts, Young's manager. He was just despairing of Young's behaviour at this point and must have been relieved when those Roxy shows came to an end. But a month later, Young took the show even further out on the road. First stop was Canada. They added more stage props. Briggs got hold of a load of auto parts and attached them to Young's piano. Hood ornaments, rear view mirrors, speedometers and hubcaps. Briggs also had t-shirts made for everyone with slogans on them like "Everything is cheaper than it looks," "Equal time for past, present and future," and "Hello, Waterface." Briggs and Young were making sure that the aesthetic vibe of the show remained consistent all the way from the first recording sessions at SIR through the Roxy shows and now out on the road. As Jimmy McDonough says in his biography Shaky, this was group art at its finest. Whether the audience got it or not seemed to be irrelevant. In Canada, they apparently did not so much. Briggs noticed with amusement the drained looks on the faces of the crowd as they left after the show. The audience thought they'd come to the wrong building, said Joel Bernstein. People were pissed off. Next up was a week in England and Scotland. A new up-and-coming young band called The Eagles were the opening act. They revered Neil Young, and they were taken aback by the newly tequila-soaked, ramshackle gonzo energy of Young and the Santa Monica Flyers, as they were now called. British audiences were also a little bewildered by the Tonight's the Night travelling circus, expecting an evening of really fine country-flavoured rock and roll and folk rock, but instead, Young said, "We came out and took 'em all to Miami Beach." The set list for these shows was the same as before. Basically, they would come out and play the entire unreleased, unheard Tonight's the Night album, but Young would then sit down and play a few acoustic songs, old favourites such as Helpless, which at the Rainbow in London on the 5th of November was an epic freewheeling version with Ben Keith on dobro and Nils Lofgren on accordion. Young, though, did cajole the audience, especially if they were even slightly restless at the idea of sitting through yet another completely unfamiliar song. In Bristol, Young introduced himself and the band as Clark Kent and the Micronite Filters, saying Neil would be along later. Between songs, he also delivered a monologue about senior citizens in Miami charging up their electric carts to go to a big nightclub show that culminated in an orgy. The crowd were so not into this by the start of the acoustic set that Young left the stage and didn't want to go back on. However, Roberts convinced him to go back out there, which he did, and by the end of the night, the band were back on stage doing Tonight's the Night for the third time of the evening, this time a wild version with Lofgren jumping up and down on the piano, playing guitar with his teeth and attempting to stomp the piano strings with his combat boots. Listening to the audience recorded bootlegs of these live shows, though, reveals that on the whole the audiences were quite willing to go along with Neil on his Tonight's the Night trip, mainly because by this point the band were a lot tighter and knew the songs so well that they couldn't help but deliver fantastic versions of them. Even on the Bristol show tape, though the audience is on the whole pretty quiet, they still clap each song and laugh occasionally at the shenanigans on stage. They were also rewarded for their patience at the end of each show, which most times would close with a couple of familiar songs, including Cowgirl in the Sand. There was negative press though. Melody Maker said the Rainbow Show was tedious. He talked too much about nothing and went on for too long, and one disgruntled fan wrote a letter to the paper saying the real Neil Young is dead. Similar comments were made in Rolling Stone about the Roxy shows. Nevertheless, the group headed back to the US for more shows, starting in New York on the 15th of November, ending in Berkeley on the 23rd. After the tour, Briggs handed Young the finished recordings and they tried to mix them at Neil's studio through the CompuMix, which was the first ever digital mixing console that had been used on Time Fades Away. Briggs thought the CompuMix sounded like shit and dubbed it the CompuFuck. He suggested remixing the album at Wally Hyder's studio, but neither of them had the energy at this point to remix the entire album, so for now the project was put on hold. Briggs maintained throughout his life that the original version was the only real version, and the released version was watered down so much that he refused to listen to it. However, Young said later, he never mentioned that to me. He never said a thing about it. The way he remembers it, he said, we had a rough mix of the whole thing, with the raps, the monologues and everything. Then, he says, somehow the raps got cut out. I don't know how that happened. If Briggs said he had finished the record and that was it, it's not true, because if he thought it was done, we wouldn't have been fucking around with the masters in the studio. Young says they tried to put the raps back in, but the tape had degraded so much that the sound on the tape had changed significantly and they couldn't get it back. The original version thus remained in limbo until inspiration to finish the album came from a very unlikely source. Elliot Roberts, Young's manager, who was horrified seeing the Tonight's the Night show live, was now floating the idea of turning the Bruce Berry story into a Broadway show. A 24-page treatment was even written for it by writer Mel Froman. To flesh it out musically, they had suggested using 3 extra songs in addition to the 9 recorded at SIR. These songs were Come On Baby Let's Go Downtown from the 1970 Crazy Horse Fillmore shows, Borrowed Tune, and Look Out Joe from the Time Fades Away era. Young didn't much like the idea of the big Broadway show, but he liked the track listing with these 3 additional songs. Around this time in 1974, Young was recording another album titled Homegrown that was very near completion, and he was staying at the legendary Chateau Marmont, which was the infamous LA hotel where John Belushi later lost his life. One night, Young was entertaining some guests in his room. These included Rick Danko and Richard Manuel from the band, Ralph and Billy from Crazy Horse, and the singer-songwriter Bobby Charles. Danko, Neil and me were sitting around the piano singing. Ralph said, "I think we'd done a little meth, because when you do meth, the harmonies are beautiful." It was godlike. They sat around listening to the almost completed Homegrown on a reel-to-reel, and then after Homegrown, Tonight's the Night came on, as it was also on that same reel. Rick Danko sat up immediately and said, "What's this?" Danko told Young, "If you guys don't release this fucking album, you're crazy." Young said later, "By listening to those 2 albums back to back at the party, I started to see the weaknesses in Homegrown. I took Tonight's the Night ultimately because of its overall strength in performance and feeling. The theme may be a little depressing, but the general feeling is so much more elevating than Homegrown." Young finished the album with the 3 additional songs and informed Warner Brothers that he wanted to release this as his next album. They were waiting for Homegrown, which they thought would be a return to the more commercial pastures of Harvest for Young. Young says they listened to the album together with Warner's in their corporate office at 1 in the afternoon at extremely loud volume, and they hated it, and they tried to talk him out of releasing it. Ultimately though, they did agree to release it somewhat reluctantly. Everyone thought it was awful, Young said later. CSN hated it, they wouldn't even mention it. Glenn Fry of the Eagles said to him, "Why are you doing this to yourself?" Young said, "I wasn't trying to make a masterpiece, I was trying to capture a moment. I didn't want to clean it up. I had to exorcise those feelings. I felt like it was the only chance I had to stay alive." When the album was released in June of 1975, after On the Beach, which was actually recorded after Tonight's the Night, if that makes sense, it was an outlier in the world of rock, visually as well as sonically. The cover was just a high contrast black and white photo of Young in his seersucker jacket and his fastback shades, arm raised, wagging his finger, the album title scrawled in his handwriting in the top right. The first pressing was printed on blotter paper, which meant it would degrade and fall apart faster than usual. Bundled inside the sleeve was an article by journalist Constant Myers, which was a review of one of the Tonight's the Night live shows. The article expressed confusion and bewilderment over the state of Young and his band's performance. Young had allowed the journalist access in exchange for several bottles of Cuervo Gold. As baffled as he was by the stage presentation, he found Young and the band backstage to be surprisingly upbeat and full of jokes. Young decided to include the article with the album, only untranslated from the original, which was in Dutch. Young said, "It seemed a good idea to print it in Dutch. Nobody in the US would be able to understand it because I didn't understand it myself, and when someone is so sickened and fucked up as I was then, everything's in Dutch anyway." Also included was an insert containing a mysterious letter addressed to somebody named Waterface. It read, "Hello Waterface. Welcome to Miami Beach. Everything is cheaper than it looks. As you know, the Santa Monica Flyer is the fastest train around. It's so fast and straight with its up to date. I'm just down here working on BB's Plane Crash album, and it sure looks good to me. Tonight's the night. We're gonna get loose in the caboose with our backs to the tracks. Yes, we're all on vacation and we deserve it. Waterface, I sincerely hope you can make it back in time. It all feels so strange. This train is just too fast. It never stops, you know, unless you get off. But I remember BB. He called my name. He said tell Waterface to put it in his lung and not in his vein. Remember Sambo who used to broadcast from the tank? He's off the air but he doesn't care. I'm sorry. You don't know these people. This means nothing to you. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Just give me a white cane and a Polaroid avoid. Goodbye, Waterface. P.S. Please take my advice." This begs the question, of course. Who the hell was Waterface? Well, don't worry. Young later cleared the whole thing up for us. He said, "Waterface is the person writing the letter. When I read the letter, I'm Waterface. It's just a stupid thing. A suicide note without the suicide." There you go. Perfectly clear, I'm sure you'll agree. Also on the insert were typed the words to the unreleased song Florida, which was later released on the Homegrown album in 2020. I say song, it's more of just a monologue, and the words are printed over the credits to the On the Beach album, which was released the previous year, along with a picture of Roy Orbison from a bootleg cassette Young had found. Everything was in black and white. The original vinyl pressing also had the words Hello Waterface and Goodbye Waterface etched into the runout on either side. Young says that originally there was meant to be a little plastic bag of glitter as well that came with the album that when opened would spill all over everything, though whether this was actually included in the original run of the album has never been confirmed. So not only had they carried on the vibe and aesthetic all the way through the recording process, all the way through the live performances, but had now packaged it into the album itself as well, despite being 18 months down the line from the original recordings. Young had even insisted on the actual record label being black instead of the orangey brown that Reprise usually was. Overall, it was an impressive artistic achievement for a high-profile major label artist. The album was praised by critics on its release. Robert Christgau gave it an A. Dave Marsh wrote positively about it in Rolling Stone, as did a lot of others. There's a case to be made for it as Young's greatest work. It's certainly his most conceptually cohesive album. Even esteemed Canadian writer Scott Young agreed. Neil's dad. He devoted a whole chapter of his book Neil and Me to the album, and he described it as being essential, like a man on a binge at Awake, a long happy bout of not giving a shit. Sadly though, apparently his mum didn't like it. The first time I heard Tonight's the Night, the song, for me was on the Weld live album recorded in 1991. Having only ever read about the song before, I was surprised by how bluesy and catchy it actually was. When I got the original album on vinyl around the year 2000, for some reason I was expecting some really heavy proto-grunge rock like Weld or Ragged Glory. Instead, the first thing you hear on the album are those ominous little piano notes tinkling out of the darkness, the wheezy harmonies, the clean tone. This original version was nothing like the Weld version, which at first was hard to wrap my head around. Lyrically, it tells the story of Bruce Berry in pretty stark terms, and also there's something vaguely unsettling about the titular phrase repeated throughout the song. Tonight's the night that... what? What's going to happen? Something happens? We do something? It's never revealed, it just keeps on being repeated. It's that word ominous again. Maybe he's saying tonight's the night for the wake to start, or maybe he's just saying the night time is now, i.e. right now it's dark. Young said that Nils Lofgren's solo right after he sings He Used to Pick Up My Guitar was deliberately in the style of Bruce Berry. Apparently Berry played guitar just like that brief solo, flashy, fast clusters of notes, and it's this attention to detail that gives the album a layered depth beyond what the otherwise apparently sloppy playing would suggest. The bluesiness continues on the second track, Speaking Out, which from the title sounds like it should be a protest song. I suppose it is, but it's more of an existential protest. He's still in a dark place, both literally, he's in a movie theatre, and emotionally. There's more than a hint of paranoia too, with the TV watching you and the notebook behind the eyes, and this is probably the only time you'll ever hear Neil Young introducing another band member as they play a guitar solo. Lofgren's solo here is pretty amazing given that he barely knew the song when they were recording it. World on a String is one he would come back to again later as well, playing it on the MTV Unplugged performance in 1993. He's saying all the success and fame in the world is pretty much worthless if your friends die. It's only real in the way that you feel from day to day. Borrowed Tune is literally that, as the song uses the same melody as the Rolling Stones song Lady Jane from their 1966 album Aftermath. Well, maybe it's just a stolen tune actually, because I'm not sure if Neil ever gave it back. I'm climbing this ladder, my head in the clouds, I hope that it matters. It's the winter here in this song. The ice is frozen 6 feet deep, and the question, how long does it take? It's not clear whether he means how long will it take to melt or how long does it take to freeze. Either way, it's bleak. 6 feet deep, by the way, like a freshly dug grave. Sticking his head in the clouds seems to help, but he's doubtful about that too. He's so frozen in this moment, he can't even compose his own melody, never mind pull himself out of this frozen grave pit. Come on baby, let's go downtown thunders in as Borrowed Tune ends, and suddenly we're hearing the departed Danny Whitten's voice imploring us to join him downtown to score, just as the full moon is rising, the light shining back from his dealer's eye, an absolutely chillingly foreboding image. If you were wondering if Danny Whitten was as great a songwriter as he was a singer, look no further. Whitten died 2 days before the full moon in November 1972. In many cultures, November's full moon is connected with death and loss. Many Native Americans referred to it as the moon when rivers start to freeze. Young refers to the full moon a lot in his work and has placed great importance on booking studio time when there's a full moon to record with Crazy Horse. It can have ominous connotations, but Young also sees the positive aspect of the full moon too, which really is about allowing the fullness of feeling to flow and to not censor yourself. 2 things which this album is all about. Mellow My Mind is a desperate plea to someone to somehow alleviate all these heavy feelings. The way his voice cracks on the line, ain't got nothing. Ralph Molina said, I still get chills when it gets to that fucking note. It's so real. Roll Another Number opens side 2 of the album. It was written in the studio during recording, and they sound well lubricated. The song is funny enough to be a moment of lighter relief on the album, whilst also still being just as bleak in outlook as the rest of the songs. Things might have gone to shit, but they're partying through it anyway. Albuquerque sees us out on the road that Roll Another Number had promised us, and it's somewhere out on the desert highway of New Mexico in a rented car. The desert is an appealing place if you want to be away from people and the scene that you've been part of. The desire for anonymity is something we all experience sometimes, even if we're not famous. New Mama was written for Carrie, the mother of Young's son Zeke, who was born in September 1972. Young decided to include this song to bring a bit of balance to the album, making sure there was a little bit of light in amongst the darkness. That even in the midst of death and grief, there's still new life coming into the world. If you think this song sounds a bit out of place with the rest of the album, I would advise you to take into consideration the poignant fact that one of the backing singers on this song is one George Whitzel, who was originally in the Rockets with Danny Whitten, Molina and Talbot before they splintered off with Young to become Crazy Horse in 1969. Lookout Joe was recorded before the Harvest Tour during rehearsals in late 1972, before those recordings were scrapped in favour of recording live on the road. As such, this is the Stray Gators that are playing on this song. Ken Buttery on drums, Jack Nietzsche on the piano. It fits in so well with the Tonight's the Night vibe though that you almost don't notice the different personnel. Young said on stage this song was about soldiers coming home from Vietnam. Cars seem to be a theme throughout this side of the record. It seems Bill sells his Cadillac to buy something to put in his arm. The theme continues with the next song, which is the darkest and bleakest moment of this nighttime of tonight. Tired Eyes. Again, we wonder what Young means exactly when he implores us to open up the tired eyes. What does he want us to see at this time of night? Well, a cocaine deal gone bad. It was actually a real event. It didn't happen directly in Young's circle, but he was close enough to it to learn some of the details and catch the vibe in a song. The events of the song took place sometime after midnight on April the 19th, 1972. There was an orgy underway in Topanga Canyon on Vision Drive. Outside the house was a drug deal occurring, but things went badly wrong. A Topanga resident known as the Doctor, who was self-admittedly a big-ass coke dealer, was involved in shifting a serious amount from 2 others, one who was a friend and the other who he didn't know. They had to make my deal to pay off another one of theirs that had gone bad, he said later. He had to sell all their stuff and have the money for them that night, but he encountered difficulty with this and struggled to achieve this, so the connection came back demanding his coke back, but ended up shooting the Doctor's friend through the back of his head. Chaos ensued, with the Doctor firing some shots back as he scrambled away, shooting the connection dead in the process. The Doctor abandoned his car full of drugs and money and escaped before the police arrived on the scene. The partygoers in the house came out to find a car full of coke and cash and 2 dead bodies lying in the driveway. The details of the double murder became common knowledge amongst the Topanga crowd, which included David Briggs. It's possibly the best song on the album, which is maybe why Young included it on Decade a few years later. The vibe is wild horses recited by a drunken preacher, and is the doomy, intoxicated feel of the album captured in its purest form. Finishing the album is Tonight's the Night, Part 2. This represents the first time that Young had the same song opening and closing an album. The next instance when he would do this was Rust Never Sleeps. The song is the same but was recorded on a different date to the first version and has a slightly different feel to it. It's looser, more open. Clearly they were more lubricated at this stage. Some would argue this is in fact Neil Young's greatest album, which it may well be. I can't really decide between this one and After the Gold Rush, if I'm being honest. It's certainly the darkest, but overall the experience of Tonight's the Night is strangely uplifting in a way. Just like Awake, it gives you permission to unload the weight off your back. A brilliant achievement. Neil Young gives you a rock and roll record about death and grief that is harrowing, but at the same time liberating. It doesn't shy away from the reality that tired eyes need to see, and it also invites you in to experience catharsis along with the band, even if you didn't know the people that they're singing about. Everyone loses someone at some point, and I can attest to the cathartic power of this music to provide a great deal of comfort through that moment. Late in 1973, Neil Young was back at his ranch recording with David Briggs. The Tonight's the Night album had already been recorded some months earlier, but for now neither of them had the desire to revisit the album in order to mix it properly for a potential release. Instead, Young was recording a few other songs that he'd written in the past year or so. These included Traces, Winter Long, which he'd already recorded with Crazy Horse back in '69, Bad Fog of Loneliness. They even did a remake of Tonight's the Night and Mellow My Mind, and two other songs, Walk On and For the Turnstiles. These two especially would set the tone for the recordings to come. Walk On featured the Tonight's the Night band minus Nils Lofgren, Billy Talbot, Ralph Molina and Ben Keith, and was recorded on the 30th of November 1973 after their insane Tonight's the Night tour had ended. For the Turnstiles was recorded on the 14th of December 1973 and featured just Young on a 6-string banjo with Ben Keith playing dobro and the pair singing harmonies on the choruses. However, before they got any further, David Briggs had to duck out. According to Briggs, he came down with a fever of 105 and was the sickest I've ever been, he said. Young and Keith carried on recording without him, which pissed Briggs off so much that he said he didn't have anything to do with Young for about a year. I don't know how true that story is, as the next sessions did not actually take place until 3 months later. But whether by design or not on Young's part, Briggs was not to take part in the subsequent recording sessions. Young decided to carry on recording at Sunset Sound in the March of '74. The main musicians involved were Ralph Molina, Ben Keith and the Harvest bass player Tim Drummond. Without Briggs there, Ben Keith proved to be the most influential of the crew. Pedal steel, dobro, guitar, vocals. These weren't the only things that the seasoned Nashville player brought to the table. It was Keith who brought in Rick Danko and Levon Helm from the band to play on a couple of songs, as well as one musician who would bring not just a brilliant off-the-cuff musical approach to proceedings, but a whole lot more besides, which ended up influencing the whole tone of the album. That musician was a Cajun wildman by the name of Rusty Kershaw. Keith had met Kershaw back in 1956, when Keith had first arrived in Nashville. Born in Louisiana in 1938, Rusty and his brother Doug were a swamp rock duo called Rusty and Doug, and they'd had a few hits in the 50s. Touring did not quite agree with Rusty though. He struggled with the concept of playing the same songs every night the same way night after night. I like to play from the top of my head. Please don't do the accent. I like to play from the top of my head, he said. To me, it's, oh man, we've got to play this motherfucker again. Kershaw brought this approach, this attitude, and his wife's cooking to the sessions. More about that later. Young, no stranger to improvising and recording raw takes, was blown away by Kershaw's ability to come up with the goods on the spot. As the sessions began, the musicians congregated at the Sunset Marquis Hotel in LA, where they made themselves at home, partying with friends and visitors who included one of the Everly brothers, no one remembers which one, Playboy bunnies, and even 70s adult film star Linda Lovelace. Bassist Tim Drummond was later quoted as saying, "We were all crazier than shithouse rats." Former member of the Rockets, the band Crazy Horse were until Neil stepped in and took them over. George Whittle got a call from Neil late one night and was invited over to join the sessions. He played guitar on Vampire Blues. Whittle said they played the song for about 15 minutes, thinking that they were just rehearsing it, before Young informed them they had now finished recording the song and invited him to hear it played back. The sessions were pretty freewheeling, with musicians encouraged to play different instruments than what they were usually used to. Ben Keith played bass, drums, organ and piano, and guitarist Rusty Kershaw lap steel and fiddle. And Kershaw brought his wife along as well, who assisted the musicians in their creative endeavours by cooking up a special concoction for their consumption, invented by Kershaw and Keith, which they called honey slides. And now, for the first time ever on this channel, we're going to have a cooking segment. Welcome to Cooking with Rusty and Ben. For this recipe you will need the following ingredients: 1 skillet, 1 large quantity of weed, and 1 jar of honey. Cooking instructions: start off by frying some weed in the skillet just until it starts to smoke and the room smells like a marijuana farm. Then you add the honey until it all looks like cow shit, and that's it. To serve, scoop up 1 tablespoon of the cow shit and eat it. According to Ben Keith, within 20 minutes of consumption of this item, you start forgetting where you are. According to Young's manager Elliot Roberts, people passed out. This stuff was like much worse than heroin, much heavier. Rusty would pour it down your throat, and within 10 minutes you were catatonic. The honey slides were a major influence on the sound of the record, in particular side 2, where the tempo slows down significantly and songs like On the Beach and Ambulance Blues run to well over 7 minutes each. Meanwhile, Rusty Kershaw was enjoying being part of the recording sessions for a major rock act. He was taking full advantage of the luxury that is room service. At the Sunset Marquis, Tim Drummond says he saw a porter wheeling in multiple cases of wine and boxes of Fritos into what he assumed was some sort of stock room. However, the porter said, "No, this is all for Mr. Kershaw's room." Kershaw's room soon resembled a scene from Apocalypse Now, with red wine stains and cigarette burns blanketing the entire area. It was like cannibals had been living in there, said Drummond in awe. It was left to Elliot Roberts to foot the bill and smooth things over with the hotel's management. In the studio, Kershaw couldn't stand the frigid, uptight atmosphere of Sunset Sound and suggested they do something to make it more comfortable. "We got to get this like your living room, man, sitting real close together, just like at home." People were duly sent out to thrift stores for furniture in order to decorate the studio, and this ended up becoming a long-standing tradition with Young, who to this day still decorates studios and the stage with pieces of homely furniture and rugs in order to make the environment less cold and unappealing. Once the antique chairs, floor lamps and candles were in place, Kershaw positioned himself as close as he could to Young whilst they played the songs, for a very specific reason. "Neil," he said, "when it'll move me the most is the first time you play it. You're going to do it your very best then, and I can play it with you the first time. We only have to sit real close together." Kershaw was saying to Young that not only did he not have to rehearse the song before they played it, he didn't even have to have had heard it at all. As long as he was right there next to him as Young played it, he would be able to play the song with Young and they would capture it in that moment. Even for Young, who had recorded his unrehearsed band playing the Tonight's the Night songs when they recorded, this was mind-blowing. How in the hell do you know how to play this thing the first time I play it? You don't know what I'm going to do. Rusty replied, Neil, you carry a heavy vibe, and if I'm sitting close to you, I can feel what you feel before you play. I know where you're going to go. This approach led to some spontaneity in the songwriting process as well. Motion pictures came out of nowhere when Young, Keith and Kershaw were sat around jamming in Ben Keith's hotel room. Neil picked up a pen and just wrote the words right then, Kershaw said later. The trio then headed straight to the studio in Young's Lincoln Continental, and in the words of Rusty Kershaw and his lovely turn of phrase, we put that motherfucker down while it was still smeared all over us. Kershaw's influence even extended to songs that he didn't play on, Revolution Blues for example. During the recording of this song, Kershaw felt like Young and the band were not quite living up to the song's title. Look man, he said, you don't sound like you're trying to start a fucking revolution. Here's how you do that. Kershaw then went batshit and started breaking stuff in the studio and shouted, that's a revolution, motherfucker. The next take they did after this is the one that you hear on the album. During the take, according to Billy Talbot's brother, Johnny, Kershaw got down on the floor of the studio and started slithering around like a snake, as if possessed. This apparently was too much even for David Crosby, who was playing rhythm guitar on the song. Kershaw took an instant dislike to Crosby and mocked him, laughing in his face, according to one observer, and then continued to roll around on the floor, howling. Stephen Stills also butted heads with Kershaw. Apparently once when Young and Kershaw were playing guitar together, Stills decided that he wanted in on the action and tried to take the guitar out of Kershaw's hands. Big mistake. Kershaw pulled a knife on him. Stephen Stills, who in the fuck is that? He said. You better get back, motherfucker. He said, you don't take a guitar from somebody's hand. It just pissed me off, he said. Without Briggs, Young had engineer Al Schmidt behind the desk, but he found the sessions hard to handle. By this point, the recording room was very dark, only very dimly lit by candles, and to communicate with the musicians, Schmidt had to send somebody out into the dark, only to find the musicians incommunicado, completely bombed out of their skulls on wine and honey slides. Kershaw also had the habit of pushing his microphone away during each take, making most of the recordings completely unusable. Having hastily assembled some very rough mixes for Young to listen back to, as soon as he heard them, Young told Schmidt that he loved the mixes and was going to use them on the album. Schmidt freaked out and basically begged Young to let him remix them, fearing his reputation would be shot if Young were to release these to the public. Schmidt wound up leaving the sessions, being replaced by Mark Harmon. Those Schmidt's rough mixes, of course, they were the ones you hear on the finished album. Mark Harmon was able to deal with the insanity a little bit better than Schmidt, having already worked with the band on their albums Cahoots and Moondog Matinee. According to Harmon, Young and his crew were now getting vitamin B12 shots to offset all the other stuff that they were doing, but says between that and the honey slides won out. One of the first things you notice about the album On the Beach is the cover, one of Neil's best, if not the best cover art of any of his albums. A cloudy day at the Santa Monica beach with ugly, tacky garden furniture, beer, and a tail fin of a '59 Cadillac inexplicably jutting out of the sand, whilst Young stands resplendent in gaudy yellow and white polyester, his back turned to us, staring out into the ocean, and under the table lies a newspaper with the headline, Senator Buckley calls for Nixon to resign. Gary Burden, who designed the cover, said that he bought the newspaper the day of the photo shoot, and that just happened to be the headline. It just happened, he said. Everything was perfect. Walk On was recorded at Young's Broken Arrow Ranch back at the end of November 73. Now, some may see this as Young's response to criticisms of the Tonight's the Night performances, as he himself had stated in the Decade liner notes 3 years later, and it may have seemed so in retrospect, but actually this song was written before that whole Tonight's the Night trip had even begun, and they had performed the song back in August 1973 at the Topanga Corral, which was the first gig with the Tonight's the Night band. So it's more likely to be about Young's falling out with Jack Nietzsche. However, Young himself doesn't remember this. See the Sky About to Rain? This song had already been released by way of a cover by the newly reformed original lineup of the Byrds in 1973. Although you could argue a better performance of this song had already been recorded at the Cellar Door in 1970, this subdued electric piano version featuring Levon Helm on drums fits the mood of the album perfectly, with some brilliantly raw images conjured by the lyrics, each image standing on its own like an old black and white photograph, signals curling on an open plain, broken clouds and rain. Track 3 is Revolution Blues. This song is famously about Charles Manson. Neil Young and Charles Manson did actually have some sort of relationship going back to the Topanga days. Young first met Manson in 1968. He was introduced to him by Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, who had been friends with Young ever since Buffalo Springfield. Wilson was close friends with Manson. Interestingly, Young and Manson shared the same birthday, the 12th of November. At this time, Manson was still just another ambitious singer-songwriter on the hippie scene, albeit one with a seemingly innate talent and intense charisma, but Young was impressed. He later said, "He was great, he was unreal. We just hung out," he said. "He played some songs for me, sitting in Will Rogers' old house on Sunset Boulevard." This was Dennis Wilson's house, and Charles Manson was round there pretty much all the time, with a huge coterie of girls who seemed to completely ignore Young and Dennis Wilson and focused instead all their attention on Manson. He said Manson made up songs as he went along, new stuff all the time. No two songs were the same. Young was so impressed that he went to Mo Austin at Warner Brothers and said, "This guy's unbelievable. He makes the songs up as he goes and they're all good." But alas, Manson never got a call from Warner Brothers to sign him up. Young believed this was probably the main reason why Manson went down the path that he did after this. Didn't get to be a rock and roll star, so he started fucking wiping people out. Dig that. One of the main reasons why this song is so powerful is that, like a lot of Lou Reed's songs, it's sung from the first person perspective, i.e. the singer adopts the Manson persona for the duration of the song. David Crosby was so completely spooked by this song, particularly its most famous line, "I hear that Laurel Canyon is full of famous stars, but I hate them worse than lepers, and I'll kill them in their cars," that he refused to play it on the CSNY tour of 1974, despite having played guitar on the song on the recording. Musically, what makes this one of the high points of the album is the hopped up performances from everyone involved, particularly Rick Danko on bass and Levon Helm on drums. The wayward notes that pop out of Danko's bass during the song do a great job of unsettling the listener just enough to remind you not to relax too much. And the drums are tight and in the groove, but just off kilter enough to have the same effect as the bass in support of the tone of the song. For the Turnstiles, a brilliant performance from the duo Young and Keith, harmonising brilliantly on the choruses. Young's voice just on the edge of cracking, like on Mellow My Mind, and Keith reaching for notes he never knew that he could reach. The lyrics are so brilliantly succinct, yet packed full of unforgettable imagery. Bush League batters dying on the diamond, sirens on the shore. Putting on my literary studies hat for a moment, there's a lot of alliteration in these lines. I love a little bit of alliteration. All the sailors with their seasick mamas, hear the sirens on the shore, singing songs for pimps with tailors who charge $10 at the door. That's fantastic writing. I get the feeling a lot of Young's experiences with CSNY and their stadium tours had a lot to do with the imagery in this song. After all, the song ends with a large crowd exiting a stadium whilst the main attractions are left to die on the inside. Vampire Blues is a return to the environmental theme of After the Gold Rush. Man's reliance on oil here is regarded as akin to sucking the lifeblood out of the planet Earth. Set to a simple blues structure, the song's creepiness vibe is enhanced massively by the unexpectedly twitchy, slithering guitar solos that Young performs here. Some of my favourite soloing by Young on any of his records. Also featured on the song is Tim Drummond playing an unusual percussion instrument. The thing that sounds like a shaker is in fact a credit card being rubbed up and down Drummond's beard. I've got to try that. I'm clearly not the musician that Tim Drummond was. Good times are coming, Young sings at the end, but we don't quite believe him somehow. On to side 2, and interestingly, apparently Young originally wanted side 2 to be side 1, and vice versa, which would have made On the Beach, the song, the first song on the Beach. He changed his mind at the last minute, although some cassettes and 8-track versions of the album were released with that alternate track listing. On the Beach, the song, is the perfect marriage of tone, feeling, performance with the subject matter of the song. It's a slow, woozy blues which starts with one of the starkest lyrics of Young's depressive period. The world is turning, I hope it doesn't turn away. Lyrically, this song encapsulates the feeling of depression as good as any I've heard, and also alienation and disassociation. Need a crowd of people, but I can't face them day to day. And whilst this is undoubtedly true for the famous rock star on his big tour, it could also apply to anyone who works in a public-facing role. Went to the radio interview, he sings, ended up alone at the microphone. In a more up-tempo setting, this lyric could come across as pretty funny. But here in this setting, coming after the previous verses, it's clear the protagonist is in danger of becoming untethered from reality. In the end, he's committed, nevertheless, to continuing on down the road, even though we don't know where it ends. Motion Pictures for Carrie. The one song on the album that's most explicitly about his relationship with Carrie Snodgrass. After all, she is name-checked in the song's title, which also references her chosen vocation. Young says it was during the making of this album that he finally realised his relationship with her was truly ending. I'm deep inside myself, he sings, but I'll get out somehow. He promises to bring a smile to her eyes, but again, we don't quite believe that will happen by this point. I'd rather start all over again, he also sings. And by the end of this album, the game was up and Neil was starting again. This song feels like the very bottom of his depression, and he can only see upwards from here. And then we get to Ambulance Blues, the final song, and the album's finale is simply one of Neil Young's greatest songs, and longest, as it runs to nearly 9 minutes. Having hit the bottom, the way he starts to come back up is, first of all, to go on a mental journey through the past. Back in the old folky days, he sings, the air was magic when we played. He's revisiting in his mind the Toronto days of 1965, where the music scene was mostly located in the Yorkville area of that city, in coffee houses where folk singers and small groups would perform in dimly lit rooms and basements. And the biggest venue at that time in terms of the prestige for the local folk singer was the Riverboat. The Riverboat was rocking in the rain. He later came back to the Riverboat in '69 and played songs from his just released debut solo album. Amongst the places Young lived in Toronto was an apartment on Isabella Street, which he also memorialises here. Oh, Isabella, proud Isabella. Toronto is also referenced again with I'm up in TO, keeping jive alive. The line, you're all just pissing in the wind, you don't know it, but you are, was apparently what Elliot Roberts said to CSNY during their years of disbandment in 72 and 73, when they were in chaos and not fulfilling their potential as far as their manager saw it. By the time this album came out, CSNY were back on the road as a touring unit, but not a particularly cohesive one, as Young soon came to realise. And the last verse, Young later confirmed it did refer to Richard Nixon, although in 74 this must have seemed a bit more obvious, as at this point the Watergate scandal was dominating the headlines at the time, which ties up neatly with the newspaper on the front cover, and an extremely fitting way for the album to end. Musically, Young admitted that the opening melody was directly lifted from Bert Jansch's Needle of Death, albeit, according to Young, an unconscious theft. I knew it sounded like something he did, he said, but when I went back and heard the record again, I realised I copped his thing. I felt really bad about that. And he went on to say, I'll never play guitar as good as that guy. He's like Jimi Hendrix or something on the acoustic guitar, which is true. Bert Jansch is awesome. One of the most depressing records I've ever made is how Young described the album after its release. But actually, although the songs accurately depict a soul in the throes of depression, like the blues, singing about it and hearing someone else sing about it induces the opposite effect in the soul of the music enjoyer. It's no coincidence here that a lot of the songs are structured like the blues, or they literally have the word blues in the title. The purpose and the effect are the same. Like another famous Neil once said, when you take the blues and make a song, you sing them out again. There you go. I bet you weren't expecting a Neil Diamond quote towards the end of this video. But hey, sometimes when you're mining for gold, you come across the odd diamond. On the Beach had an unusual afterlife for a Neil Young album. Like Time Fades Away, Young shied away from reissuing the album for many years, whether down to audio issues, or the fact he didn't want to put it out on compact disc, or just a reluctance to revisit the album. It's not clear, but it had become so highly regarded over the years, cited by many, including R.E.M. as a major influence, that he finally gave it the remaster it deserved and reissued it in 2003. In my opinion, this album is right up there in the top 3 or top 4 of Neil Young's albums. Now, I don't like those videos where they rank albums from worst to best. As for me, there should be room for ambiguity when it comes to something as subjective as music, but there's no doubt about it for me. This is top tier Neil, in the same rank as After the Gold Rush and Tonight's the Night. And if you disagree, well, you're just pissing in the wind. You don't know it, but you are. Good times are coming. Bye for now.